Hello, I'm Jordan Horton, and I'm the curator at the Visual Arts Center of New Jersey. I have the privilege of leading and designing our presentation here of In Conversation Will Wilson. The original iteration was organized by Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art and curated by Mindy Benshaw, curator of American Art, and Ashley Holland, curator from Art, associate curator of Art Bridges. To give overview of the show, In Conversation brings the work of Dine or Navajo photographer Will Wilson, born in 1969, and Edward Sharif Curtis, who lived from 1868 to 1952. Wilson's work examines the relationship between science, identity, agency, and representation in photography, while confronting the long impact of historical images of how Native Americans in the North American region have been represented. This exhibition and podcast was made possible by Art Bridges. And joining with me, and as we are in the last version of this podcast series, we have Dennis Redmoon Darkeem, who's been our lovely host this entire time, but now we get to flip the camera and microphone to talk to him rather than him talk to us. And Dennis is a multimedia artist, educator, and cultural advocate. Bronx born, he is raised of the Yamasee Creek Seminole, Native American, and African American descent. He's worked across installation, photography, sculpture, drawing, painting, sound, and performance. And his practice explores the themes of transformation, generation, and honor. He holds a BFA and an MFA in art direction from Pratt Institute and has over a decade of experience in arts. And one thing that I noticed that I've seen Dennis' work before I met him was the Patchwork Travelers, which was a site-specific installation at the New York Penn Station in 2022 as a part of the Art at Amtrak Public Art Program initiative. So, hello, Dennis. It's really nice to speak to you today.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, and thank you for allowing me to be here today.
Absolutely. So just to, as I mentioned, we'll be talking about the exhibition In Conversation, which is up at the Visual Arts Center of New Jersey right now. A collaboration with Art Bridges. And so when I was working on the show, I think here at the Art Center we have three galleries, and we try to have a through line through all the galleries. And seeing Will Wilson's work, I was like, cool, photography, easy through line. But as I worked with him and his work, I realized it's so much more than photography. I had the delight of encountering Will Wilson's work when I was in grad school, as I took an indigenous art class, and so I learned about this very project, which was an honor for me to then be able to create a iteration of the show. And so, as I mentioned, it's a lot more than about photography. It's questions about power, who creates images, who represents, and who is represented, and who gets to control an archive. I think we see archives as a very matter of fact thing, but as we know, and seeing your practice too, archives do not have this neutrality that perhaps it may seem to have. And so, with that, I just wanted to ask you about your first reactions to Will Wilson's work. Um, yeah, I see that you use photography in your work too, so I just wanted to see your thoughts on his work and perhaps how you use photography in your own.
Awesome. So I think photography has always been a powerful vessel, and the idea of preservation and talking about artifacts is kind of our connection to past, present, and future. So
Mm,
that's one reason I love photography, and just seeing generations in front of your eyes through imagery, color, design. Um, it gives you so much context, uh, place, environment, all of these different things. And I feel that Wilson's work definitely embodies this want to connect to the past, present, and future. And I think I strive for that as well, of connecting the dots and allowing um, research, new narratives to all kind of align in this new baby or work of art that's being blossom. And I really love the connection to this idea of experience. So
mm,
working in photography, everyone has their own um, kind of choreography of, may it be the idea of setting up lighting, may it be of processing film, maybe developing. So it's this process of your this own piece of history you're creating with your body and motion that it also creates memory. So it's this idea of what the public gets to see, but there's also this personal, and I can feel this in his work, and I kind of embody this within my work because it becomes this full experience that lies within the artist, and then it gives this critique, it gives this call and response from the public. Um, but I think this using photography as this vehicle to connect the dots is very powerful, and I feel many photographers and artists hold this understanding how powerful photography can be.
Hmm. Absolutely. So let's talk about this vehicle of photography, right? So just the outward context of photography, it emerged in the 19th century. And what was also happening in the 19th century? Colonial expansion, right? And so like it's widely understood, especially at that time, especially, it was such a like groundbreaking technology that many people saw as objective. They saw it as scientific, they saw it as fact. But even back then you were able to to impose or kind of manipulate and edit photos, and that editing comes in that posing too that you speak of, this choreography that you speak of. And so in practice it was often used to classify and control a narrative. It became a tool for ethnography, anthropology, racial categorization, colonial record keeping, as we'll get into with Edward's work. um, Notable things from of the history of photography that stood out to me was the accessibility that came about of the brownie box camera in the 1900s, as it only cost $1, and really, which is crazy because that actually makes it worth $39 in today's currency, which shows
Wow.
inflation. um, and so you have that came about in 1990 and made photography accessible. But I also think about the Shirley card, which was this image of a white woman who she was brown hair and white, and that was used to color correct photos. But that just that in that representation you eliminated so many people with darker skin, and just of different ethnicities, with this standard being the Shirley card. um and show that just shows how photography frequently centered whiteness, and marginalizing other people. And in that, indigenous people were kind of depicted as types rather than the individual people. And so, with that context, I wanted to ask, I don't know, why did photography gain such an authority as this truthful medium? Can photography ever be neutral? And how does that history still shape image making today?
Um, Very powerful question.
Thank you.
So talking about displaced and misplaced people who have been edited out of the idea of what is American history, and that has been simple things as names. So many of the tribes we know of today, these were not their names many moons ago, and this is because Europeans have documented and intermarried and developed this idea of what we call indigenous identity, and many of us, if you're on the East Coast, West Coast, South, there's this kind of understanding you have to abide by, this look that you have to go for, and so having to cut through all those grass and weeds, it's this understanding of trying to find what's authentic and keeping what we find valuable and connection. So a lot of this takes place within our families. So that's
Mm,
the first powerful um, mechanism of how we document each other. And I think on how we document each other as a family is how people go and document the world. And that
mm,
is who is acknowledged within the family, who's the troublemaker, who gets the picture time. And I think also when you're talking about creating history and taking land, um, you have to paint pictures to say who. was here and who was not here. And that becomes kind of the order of how Europeans were able to navigate people's culture. And the strike of the pen, may it be photography, may it be religion, these were all vehicles of controlling narratives. So
Mm-hmm.
adding photography and adding um, film, all of these ideas of it brings a broader audience to kind of focus on a deeper view or a controlled narrative that allows us to believe that in this one area, everyone looked the same, or in this
Yeah.
area, there was no running water. In this area, so it's all make believe, and we have to realize this is a part of American culture, make believe, right? We
Mm-hmm.
this idea of come here, you find everything you need, and that's how, so that understanding of um, if you make it, they will come, right? So
Yeah.
this idea of you control this narrative. Oh, it allows us to be in control and allow other people to say, hey, this is what your family should look like.
Absolutely. Yeah, what was manifest destiny but delusion, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Um and once again getting back into your practice and how you appropriate or reclaim images rather and kind of build collages on that. It also makes me think of the artist Wendy Red Star and specifically her work of 1880 Crow Peace Delegation, in which she takes these historic images of indigenous folks and annotates them and kind of points out who this person was or um, what what was the piece of clothing that they were wearing and why that was important. And I got to speak to her about this and she was telling us really funny stories about like just the context you can't glean from a photo. So yes, once again taking this idea of kind of reclaiming these historic images that a lot of indigenous folks were kind of made to sit for and be represented in a way that they didn't have the agency to speak for themselves. What is it to you, and can you speak more about these images that you take from archives and then kind of add or embellish with collage?
Yeah. So as far as collage work, I do want to um, create connections that we are not taught in school. We may not see. So this understanding of Mayan, Aztec, all of these uh, ruins, and see there was trade that happened. There was languages that were happening, and we look today and we see, oh, this is I'm not understanding the layers of um, conquering that took place. And when we go back to this understanding of who conquered who and these narratives. So when we talk about Wendy Red Star, I love that work and
Mm-hmm.
her pointing out the significance of adornment, clothing, or war, all of these connected dots to like travel and how people were navigating and moving, maybe because of being displaced, but more or less trying to hold on to culture and connection. So I think when I use photography, when I'm using imagery, I'm trying to create these cross cultural connections that allow people to see um, wait, I never thought about living in a dark place and living in a beautiful sunny place. The people are going to be dark skinned, right? So these images
Right.
of of like European, so we that allows us to now see who's a narrative of these stories that we've been kind of controlled to believe, and so that's what I'm trying to a lot much of my work try to bring that forward, this understanding. Look beyond Disney, look beyond what we has been beautiful images, but there's a history that connects to us in a language. And I think that is the hard part. Where and how do we research, right? And what
Right.
narratives do we go by and what elders do we talk to? So all of this
Mm-hmm.
also starting with artwork, hopefully it makes people ask questions at home within family first, and then you know, kind of broaden out to other communities where, may it be the Caribbean, there's a deeper history once we kind of pull the pages back from European narratives of who we are, how we are connected to Earth.
Absolutely. Um, and so, like, as we talk about these historical images, right? One of the most associated people with this history, unfortunately, is Edward Curtis, right? Whose photography appears along Wilson's in this exhibition. I think something that was really impressive to note is the name of the show before it, I think in its original iteration was at Crystal Bridges, was In Conversation Edward Curtis and Will Wilson. And since then, it's just In Conversation Will Wilson. And we'll get more into like how naming really shows power. And I think that was really a great move on the original curator's part of centering it around Will Wilson, but we can't deny that Edward Curtis is the person he's having this conversation with. And so, just to give a bit more context about Edward Curtis, he had this idea, let's say, called the myth of the vanishing Indian. Edward Curtis worked on the North American Indian Project for over 30 years. And this large scale project, he started originally, he actually went in 1906. He approached who we know as J. Piermont Morgan of J.P. Morgan, in hopes that he would finance this venture to photograph the indigenous people of the U.S. Morgan really enjoyed this idea and the quality of Curtis's photographs and the ambition of the project, and offered to fund the field work, but not the publication itself, which I think is like I wonder why. But after his Curtis did this self promotion between 1907 and 1930. There was a 20, he illustrated 20 volumes to accompany a portfolio of large format photos. And the series intended to document the traditional culture of every Native American tribe west of the Mississippi, working with 80 different indigenous communities and alongside consistently rotating field teams of ethnologists and Native American assistants. Curtis collected ethnological data and made thousands of photographs, motion pictures, and wax cylinder drop recordings. And the thing that's kind of difficult about looking at Edward's work is objectively it's nice, like I can't deny it's actually really beautiful. I don't think Wilson was drawn to him for a reason. We look back at his photos for a reason, even with this very tough history. One of the many things that was an issue about Edward was he was photographing this because he believed indigenous people and culture was disappearing. He reinforced what scholars call now the vanishing Indian narrative. um and one, I just, for the record, I want to say that I'm using Indian as it's like described here, not in my own vernacular. As I think we've gone past the better uses of indigenous and native people to describe um, them. And so, I'm thinking about ideas of stage photographs. Curtis removed modern objects. He selectively presented people in a way. The constant stereotype of romanticizing indigenous life, this idea of off the grid, this civilized people, which we are proud to know is not the case, and uh, is explored way more in the exhibition, and I think in just indigenous studies now. But that essentially was a very big origin story of indigenous representation. And so I just wanted to ask you about ideas with that. Like, what do you think about this in regards to power dynamic? How that shaped a lot of preconceived notions of indigenous people, especially in the early 20th century. Um, how does Curtis's work sit with you as an indigenous artist? Ideas of power. Yeah,
So I'm just trying to get it all
I
back.
know. I'm like throwing it at you. My bad.
No, but no, it definitely got me thinking, and so many things was popping in my head that when you were asking the question. So I think one thing that I want to bring up is that we are in a time, in a day and age where now we can look up or look up like, the history of these people who are the creators are who establish blueprints, right? And we can see what churches they went to. We can see what
Mm-hmm.
organizations they were a part of. We can see what school, all of this stuff. And when we begin to research, we begin to see these people who believed that they were preserving were more establishing a takeover. So when you are part of organizations like the Order of the Red Man, which was an all white male fraternity that was huge, hugely popular before what is now, we have Freemasons, so they were the secret society that controlled the narrative of indigenous people, which many of them took on the identity and culture of their local tribes or indigenous
Mm-hmm.
communities that were located. There's memberships all over the United States. You can look this up. And many people who had the opportunity to go to these amazing colleges, universities, all took part of these orders or these fraternities and communities. And this is the reason why we have a lot of documentation um, of indigenous Black and Asian cultures that was collected through people who were part of a bigger understanding of how they can control narratives. So thinking about that background and how people are, it was explained that they were preserving, but more or less taking over in culture that allow other people access. So when we also think about who is who would be the community that you're creating this for, and or who would be the community that's represented, where would you show this? So thinking about that time and think about this thinking of preserving, what does that really look like? That's just one thing when we talk about that connection to the why. Why was this important, and how does it inspire today? And I feel the inspiration gives dialogue for us today, for us to have this conversation,
Yeah.
for people to see, hey, this is a controlled narrative, right? Or more of, this makes me wonder why these people were selected, or at this time, what was the geography of Mexico, and who was trying to take over this land if we control this narrative of names, United States. So thinking further, when we do research in history, we understand the motivation to preserve these small pockets of indigenous communities, and which and how locations and names were changed to
Mm-hmm.
expand other groups to feel, oh, they were indigenous, so we're the Native Americans. If we're the Native Americans, then so we could just keep changing names, and then we can just no longer remember whose bodies and bones are buried under the land. So
Absolutely.
that is so when I think about preserving, and I think about this artistry and the responsibility of um, taking something historic and allowing us to create dialogue or create avenues that allow us to question, wait, is this progression, or is what is this, and we all can add a different name of what this feels like to us.
Mm. Yeah, and you touch on it, but like mentioned, like even though the intention was not great from Edward Curtis, he provided a very large archive of folks that perhaps not, I don't want to say weren't, would not be archived today, but it was a very robust archive that clearly artists such as Red Star and Wilson are using now. That, what do you think are the responsibilities that photographers have when documenting communities that aren't their own, in a contemporary sense? I think we are at a point in art where there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of intermingling of just different ways of life, and I think a lot of things come up, especially in like African American studies and indigenous studies. It's actually a lot of people who are not of those cultures who contribute to the field. So what do we do with people who want to contribute to the field but perhaps aren't coming from the field? Like what does that positionality look like to you? As you I'm sure you've seen your number of people who've spoken out on African American or indigenous things that have are well intended but just don't have that original origin. Does that take validity away from them? And I say that like acknowledging that Edward Curtis was like in a league of his own, of like he wasn't necessarily doing that with like no harm, no foul intention. But yeah, just how do people and photographers and people who document things approach communities that aren't their own now?
Uh, um, I think. Oh wait, it gets really
There's no right
again.
one answer. Yeah.
Oh no, no, no. I definitely understand, but I also, from what I experienced, there's this deeper acknowledgement of what people learn in school, and usually they learned it from first grade to maybe junior high school. In high school, they said some names that, but it was usually Pocahontas and a few other people they remember, right?
Sacagawea.
Each
Yeah.
Geronimo, right? It's
Yeah.
these, and usually it's all connected to out west. So I I, I get a lot of different I get different understandings of people, of what people believe, race and identity, and how you should identify all of these different things, which was all created by people who have no clue. Usually, the people who are telling me are telling us who we should be have no clue about their own identity and their own
Right.
connection.
Mm.
It's all been the same history they learned from pre-K to junior high school, and that when we peel back this understanding of what we're taught in school is not at all um, every person of color um, has this understanding that we're all from Africa, right? And when you break down the history, you understand how names, because Africa was named many names as well, right? Ethiopia, there was so many names, right? But understanding we all have deeper connections, and there are black people
Yep.
all over this world, and that started civilizations. There were people from Mali traveling and connecting here, the United States. So when we think about who has control, we have the control to define and research who we are, right? And
Mm.
once you take ownership and reclaim your family connections, all of these things that you were never taught, right? And through that comes research. Then you can now understand why people who are of different descents, Hispanic or European or Canadian, whatever their understanding of their culture, they're usually trying to put that on you,
Right.
and and those are usually negative. So at the end of the day, in America, we always like anything connected to black is always negative. That's what we've been taught since the 40s and the 50s and 60s, right? And this we're just now becoming to where people can celebrate black identity, culture, Juneteenth, right? These are all nuance that we're so. This is the same thing when black people are, when we say black African American people, again, Jesse Jackson made his name up in the six. So when we
Yep.
understand and peel back these names, how we were displaced from our land and our culture, um, how we were citizens of nations before the United States. But it's easy for us to say we all came in boats, that we can
Mm-hmm.
find dinosaur bones, but we can't find slave ships, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's all of these things that if we keep saying it, people will believe it, and it doesn't make it true. It just makes it hard for the next generation to find self love. And
Mm-hmm.
if we can break self love, then we can tell anybody anything, right? And we have people who will believe um, what they believe in the Bible, and there's nothing wrong with these things, but it's the understanding what is your origin, and it has to be bigger than what you can pick up in any book that the library or they taught you in school. Because I feel many cultures have connections to religion, and you question, hey, how did you get to be this, right? Was it through force or was it through submission? Um, going further on, but going too much, but thinking about
No.
the deeper roots and why people are distanced to acknowledge the black or the roots of our culture. Because when we talk about the interaction between Spaniards and French and Dutch and Columbus, they knew that they were different than the people who were standing in front of us. And somehow um, these connections to people who are in control of narratives of indigenous or native or whatever new names that we have to identify as.
Mm,
Um, once we can control those names, and once we can be have self pride in how we want to identify. We want to be Afro Indigenous. We want to be Indigenous, but understanding how people became Native American, right?
yeah.
So we have to research every name, and once you start researching the name, you can understand how it belongs to land. I'm gonna stop
Mm.
there.
No, that's thank you for that. And with names, I think what also complicates it is borders, right? Like the US borders aren't able to um understand or iterate the ways that tribes and nations existed, right? Like even with land acknowledgments, we acknowledge maybe like one tribe that lived there, but we know that many people moved around or there's coexisting or some nations kind of absorbed into another, some aren't seen as official. And so like I am thinking about borders that come along with names too. You mentioned, that we learned this in school, and honestly, one thing that's great about working here at the Art Center is we have a lot of school groups come through. And one thing that is also true now is school is not teaching things that it used to teach, or never did, or is really like whitewashing the curriculum. And so it's been a pleasure to have school groups come through here because I see museums as, while complicated, right? When we talk about like colonial expansion, we have to talk about the museum. But, I've been able to use exhibitions to teach things that aren't really being taught in school, or the things that are being banned in school I can talk about in shows. And when kids come to see shows, they're able to learn that way. And so it's been really lovely to see students learn about indigeneity and Will Wilson by coming through the art center. And in the show, there's just, he shows just so many different people and gets away from that, like, these people look this way. There's Afro Indigenous photos in the show. There's people who may seem white, etc. So just kind of breaking that stereotype of this is how Indigenous people look. Their skin looks like this. Their hair looks like this, etc. And showing just like how large and vast, and how like every other religion or culture is not a monolith. And so, in speaking about the show, I wanted to look at two works in particular, kind of do a visual analysis of Will Wilson and Edward Curtis. The first image we spoke about, Dennis, is the Edward Curtis Girl in a Jar. And just to describe it for the listeners, this is all the works in the show are black and white. They're all using the practice of wet plate photography, which is a 19th century style photography that was really clunky and very immersive, of like dunking a plate into this like chemical, and in all of them you kind of see this chemical dripping on the side, which I think is makes the work very painterly, and once again shows not only the impressiveness of the posing of the work, but the science behind photography and the technology that was new to Edward was old to Wilson. And so I just wanted to speak about and I'm sure we'll have the image on here in post, but to describe for those who are listening, the work Girl in a Jar, San El Defonso. Apologies if I'm saying that wrong, but this image was made in 1905 by Edward Curtis. It's a black and white portrait, tightly framed with a shallow background. So everything is focused on the single figure, who's in the center of this image. The person, supposedly like a young girl, she's facing forward, looking to the camera, and in the lower half of the frame, um, is kind of her, so like brows down, but in the upper half of the frame is a large ceramic vessel that's balanced on her head. She's not holding it anyway, it's just kind of sitting on her head. The vessel, it's kind of gourd like, and it's narrow at the top with a fuller body. um its surface is decorated with patterns and curving lines that wrap around it. I would say this image is really striking for the balance that it has. It sits directly, the jar sits directly on the person's head. And it just is a very clear cut line between where the jar sits and where her head begins. And so it feels very posed. I dare I say architectural. And the figure, she has layers of beads around her neck. And her clothes are minimal but in frame, but it really emphasizes her upper body and her shoulders. um has very soft but directional lighting, creating these really nice shadows that define her face. You really get an emphasis of her cheekbones there. And you can't really see much in the background, there's just no sense of place in it. um it's really just the girl in the jar, as Edward so rightfully names. And so you can just see a very controlled, informal studio portrait style that Edward Curtis is working with. Um, and something that just like stuck out to me, besides the image of it, is once again getting back to naming. The title of his work is just Girl in a Jar. It has no insight about who she is, not who she is individually. And what I know from is he saw this as an example of what a like Pueblo woman looks like, or a Pueblo girl looks like. And this ability to hold this water on her head was seen like as a phenomenon. Um, and yeah, Edward, he notoriously did not record the names of his subjects, as if he didn't care about it. And kind of showed these people more as like representatives or types of people. You know, she stood in as a type of Pueblo woman. And so I just wanted to ask, with that description, Dennis, what do we lose when we reduce someone to a type? And how does naming, or the absence of it, shape our understanding? So here I am years later looking at this. What am I supposed to take away from it?
Um, so as you were describing, I
Yeah.
was like, oh my God, like it makes it all comes together. So, um, when we're talking for when indigenous communities are talking about what does it look like to preserve, so this image would be a representation for possibly a young girl who was maybe 13, 14 today
Yeah.
to understand textile and how that connects to her. um, how the importance of a bowl or a jar and these patterns are symbolic to that particular community of
Yeah.
Pueblo women. So it gives us location, it gives us connection to the environment, it gives us connection to skills and artifacts. So allowing us, the future, to look back at the past and say, oh, if I want to be, so today, a lot of many people from different tribes, we have the access of our great grandparents' belongings, may it be medicine bags, may it be blankets, may it be beadwork, may it be patchwork, all of these things we're able to see what was the medicine back then, what was healing, what seeds did they collect, um,
Mm.
what type of, where did they get materials, like how did horsehair become part of doll making, like how
Hmm.
did, why did they use sassafras, right? So all of this gives us today a bit of insight on how our ancestors survived or how they were connected to land, and it allows us to say when we wear something, are we adorn ourselves, we are authentically representing our ancestors.
Mm.
So thanks to Wilson's images like these, it gives his people, his tribal people, or his connection, a little bit of outlet for their future to understand um, their connection to um, the art or uh, just their ancestors. And I think for again, we won't understand that or be taught that in school. So
Yeah.
this is how powerful photography is, and this work is as a vessel.
Yeah, and I just wanted to give clarification that that work was of Edward Curtis, but I think everything you said still stands true of while this while this image does give us insight, right, of like what a Pueblo girl may look like, or the things that she may have, what she would wear, this like deletion of her individuality, um we lose that part in the archive, right? We this is when I think a lot about Sadia Hartman and critical fabulation. We have to then fabulate in this archive because it wasn't seen as this was extraneous information to Edward Curtis, right? He didn't care or think it mattered who this individual person was. And I think, just to transition, this is where Edward Curtis's work stops, and I think where Will Wilson's work picks up. Um, Will Wilson, we went from Edward Curtis's work, "Girl in a Jar," to I show you my post-it note of how long this title is from Will Wilson. It is Nakota Lawrence, citizen of the Hopi Nation, six-time world
Mm.
champion hoop dancer member, Dancing Earth, Indigenous Contemporary Dance Creations, Critical Indigenous Exchange Project, Santa Fe Institution, 2012, printed 2018. And first off, like, what a mouthful the title is, and every title in the show, and most of the titles of his project, the Critical Indigenous Exchange Project, is long. So it includes the name of the sitter. In this case, it includes that he's a six-time world champion Hopi dancer. It includes the tribe that he's from, the Hopi Nation. And then it also includes the place that this took where this took place. So this was sat at the Santa Fe Institution. And one thing that I thought was lovely, and as I said before, museums are very complicated, but they're trying their best to get back into our well graces. And I think Will Wilson was really able to leverage that and having collaborations with institutions such as the Denver Art Museum in Colorado and the Santa Fe Institution in New Mexico to have the portraits that he took be situated in these institutions. They house this. But I go on this long tangent to really emphasize how beautiful and how thoughtful the title alone was. I didn't even get into the description of the work, right? But from that title, we know so much about him. And I think something that's important to note is the work was shot in 2012, but printed in 2018. And one thing that Will Wilson did in this project was after he took a photo of the sitter, and this was after negotiation, he asked them how they wanted to be represented, come as they wanted to be. He gave the original wet plate to the sitter and then asked permission from them to show it elsewhere. And so I think that gets back into this idea of not even reciprocity, but permission, for agency. Like every sitter has the right to say no, I want this. And so us seeing it as a gift, and has been through this is after a negotiation of the sitter to Wilson, which I think shifts the power dynamic back into the sitter, in a way that Edward Curtis took that away. Yeah, that just wanted to give a note about what power exists in the title of naming things. Um, and to describe it once again to those who cannot see it, this is a black and white photograph that I think on first glance looks very um, historical, right? It looks like a 19th century studio portrait. In the photo, you have a seated figure. I would assume he's a teenage boy around the ages of like 16 to 18. And instead of sitting on this stool, he crouches on it, like he's squatted on the stool. He has long hair that falls over his shoulders, and he's wearing a plain white tee. And which to note is not this traditional dressing that perhaps we would be used to seeing an indigenous person sitting in. Um, and around his neck he has these headphones on, like the headphones we're wearing right now. um and he holds a game controller, and he has a manga that's also in his hand. And so like this is a clear nod to like um a modern day, present day person. And I think this like clashing of this historical use of photography but everyday things in his hand, I think is really lovely. And one thing that's my favorite part about the photos is across from that sits across from his on his torso is the hoop, to make reference that he is this like 6-time world hoop dancer champion. And so I love this work because I point this work out as like the concept of indigenous people are just everyday people, like once again like um de-romanticizing them, and showing that they exist and like things that everyone else likes, like music and anime. That is just a worldwide fascination of teenage boys. um that yeah Just wanted to like bring up that description of Will Wilson's sitter, or I can say his name actually, of Nakota, since we have that here. um and so, yeah, I just wanted to ask, with that long explanation, how does portrait challenge expectations here? And um, yeah, what do you think Edward Curtis would have thought of this? Do you think he would have like removed some things? Like how does this differ from Edward Curtis's work, even though it's still you know taking an image of an indigenous person and posing them? Just can you talk about the contrast you see in their work here?
Oh wow. Yes. So I think I can share. So I think because of Curtis, many indigenous communities and also Black, African American, Afro indigenous communities have a weird connection with portraits or people taking images. So there's this understanding, because you don't know where your image is going to be.
Right.
Many tribal nations didn't, for many moons, didn't allow photography or you to look directly into a camera. And there were spiritual reasons. There
Mm,
were reasons of you're going to be uh, uh, put in a boarding school, or so there were many kind of stereotypes connected to images being taken. So I feel this understanding of making a connection where giving permission or asking permission, but also allowing someone else to decide where they want this work image to live, and allow that to be where you are just the vessel taking, or kind of celebrating this moment, right? But it wouldn't be your moment. It wouldn't be your image. You don't control this. So acknowledging how this damage of Curtis and this idea of just mishandling culture, narrative, language, items, people, like just, and this goes from Africa to Hawaii,
yeah.
Alaska, where people just take, 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 and no one has control. And it's only now today where people are demanding things back, to demanding museums, demanding like institutions give things back, that there was no real understanding of barter, trade, connection. It was just, so at, when we that is another level to this exhibit, where we are now getting, when people say acknowledgement, or how do we give land acknowledge or people acknowledge, right? So these are avenues where he's showing and proving to people, giving examples on how indigenous communities have preserved this
Yeah.
understanding of documentation. And a lot of documentation is it comes from things that are handmade or things that are picked, or so there is energy in these items. So
Hmm.
for people who have no connection or have no understanding on how certain items have cultural language or spiritual beliefs from things that come from the earth, uh, is the reasoning why I believe, um, this Wilson's work is not just for the outsider, but it's also for indigenous communities to
Yeah.
reflect and think, how are we giving and how are people taking?
Mm. Absolutely. Like, especially with this, as he calls it, like this exchange program, and that just act of asking the sitter how they would like to be represented, and then asking for permission after he's taken a photo, I think definitely highlights what you're mentioning of, just kind of non-Westerns idea of borrowing and reciprocity. That once again, going back to museums, I when I was in grad school, I we have our grad school sits on the homeland of the Stockbridge Munsee people, and they're while they are based in what we call Wisconsin, their office is in Western Massachusetts and upstate New York. And we had someone speak to us about NAGPRA and how awful NAGPRA is, right? I think a lot of museums tout NAGPRA as like this, look, we're giving things back, like, aren't like we're doing so good, but you have the things and the hoops that people have to go through to get items back. She was talking about how she had to go through death records to prove that these remains were of her ancestors, and they just don't make it easy at all, to get things back. And so I think Will Wilson's really setting a beautiful example of reciprocity that institutions can learn from, slash that learning might dismantle them altogether. um yeah. Let's see, I thank you so much. I want to be mindful of the time we have, and just to close out, Edward Curtis, he asked us how indigenous cultures could be preserved before they disappeared. Will Wilson begins from a different premise that indigenous people are still here, they're still creating, they're still adapting and defining themselves on their own terms. And so I just wanted to close out with that. Thank you so much, Dennis, for talking with me. I would love to talk to you off camera and just, muse you even more. This has been really a great conversation. And thank you, Art Bridges, for um, providing and making this podcast and this exhibition possible at the Visual Arts Center. The show In Conversation Will Wilson would be up at the Visual Arts Center, New Jersey until August 23rd, which is 2 months out from here today. Thank you once again, Dennis. I really enjoyed talking to you.